From our 22 News Broadcast Center, this is 22 News in Focus.
Well, good Sunday afternoon and welcome to 22 News in Focus. I'm Juliana Mazza. It is a debate that's been going on for years here in Massachusetts and across the country. The legalization of recreational marijuana. Now, medical marijuana is already the law of the land here in Massachusetts, and right now there is a campaign to create a November ballot question where you, the voter, could decide if recreational marijuana should be legalized as well. Now, today on 22 News in Focus, we will explore the impact of legalizing recreational marijuana and how likely that is. On our panel today is State Senator James Welch, Will Luzier from the Campaign to Regulate Marijuana Like Alcohol, Northwestern District Attorney David Sullivan, and Dr. Robert Roos from Sisters of Providence Health System. Well, thank you all for joining us today. So my first question, who here thinks legalizing recreational marijuana is a good thing?
I do.
Why?
Because marijuana prohibition has been an abject failure, and we're going to allow the voters in Massachusetts to decide to regulate marijuana like alcohol, which means that the businesses will pay taxes, they'll create jobs, drive down youth access, and take the commerce away from gangs and cartels.
Does anyone else agree with that standpoint?
Well, I would say I probably fall in the middle. I would say I'm undecided at this point as a legislator, still gathering information. We as State Senate Commission on Marijuana, the Special Commission, just got back from Colorado on a fact-finding mission to see what challenges Colorado has faced and what they've done well, what they've done poorly, and what they could have done differently. So I'm in a position right now where I haven't taken a stance one way or the other, either for or against. I am confident, though, that if the ballot question were to pass in Massachusetts, that we as a state and as an administration and from a regulatory standpoint would be able to, learning from other states, would be able to address the situation and put a safe system into place.
Okay, Attorney Sullivan?
I'm strongly opposed, and it's for a number of reasons. Number one, it exploits and it harms youth. The mean age for a youth trying marijuana is 12.8 years old. And the big tobacco that hurt us for years with cancer from nicotine is going to be big marijuana. The whole idea is to get people hooked between 12 and 21. And that's what this campaign is about. It's about making sure that marijuana is more accessible, more acceptable for our youth. And the teen brain development is a critical issue. Marijuana impacts that teen development the same way as alcohol and other drugs do. But we have this opportunity to say enough is enough. We have decriminalized marijuana. It hasn't been a crime to possess marijuana since 2008. We made medical marijuana acceptable for those that have debilitating illnesses. And at this point, this marijuana lobby is about exploiting children.
And you touched upon an issue talking about health. Dr. Roos, what's your opinion on this?
So as an addiction specialist, an expert, and somebody who treats the wide range of substance use disorders, I also have concern and am opposed to the legalization of marijuana because we already have a situation where more than 22 million individuals use marijuana or other cannabis-derived products that have been shown to have negative health impacts. And what we do know, generally speaking, as D.A. Sullivan stated, as substances become more available, they tend to become more readily used. And as an addiction specialist, amidst a terrible opiate epidemic currently, I have concerns about moving in a legalization direction for another psychoactive substance that has addictive properties.
Can I?
Please.
I have to respectfully disagree with the district attorney that this is targeted at youth. The initiative petition, the initiative that's been filed, will require the sale of marijuana to be only to folks who are over the age of 21. And honestly, we are as concerned as anyone else with youth having access to marijuana. But 80% of the high school seniors say that marijuana is either easy or fairly easy to get. And that's because no one's asking them for their IDs. If you take this commerce and put it in a regulated framework where folks are asked for IDs every time they purchase, we are sure that youth access will go down. And so it's not about respectfully targeting youth.
It's all targeted at youth. Most of the marijuana used today is marketed as an edible. They're gummy bears. They're chocolate milk. I brought gummy bears. This is a package of marijuana in Colorado and Washington. It's not about smoking pot anymore. It's making it easily accessible so kids can consume it before school, during school, and after school. Chronic use of marijuana in Massachusetts represents, youth are 55% of the admissions in Massachusetts, and that's for cannabinoid use disorder. 55% right now of all the admissions for adolescents. It's outrageous. We have an epidemic right now, and we're only going to add to that epidemic of use.
Senator Welch, you were in Colorado.
I was, and I think one thing to keep very clear in our minds is that Colorado was a much different situation from their state standpoint than will be placed in potentially if the ballot question passes. And District Attorney Sullivan held up the gummy bears or the gummy worms, which is a very real concern. But the position that Colorado was placed in, because their question was passed as a constitutional amendment. So once it was passed, it was set in stone. In Massachusetts, like Washington, if the question is passed and approved by the voters, we in Massachusetts, from a regulatory standpoint, will be able to address a lot of the issues and concerns we have about edibles. I think that's the one thing we learned about having conversations with Washington officials, is that they've really put in strong regulations about the packaging of edibles and about the different forms that edibles can be found in. And in Massachusetts, should it pass, we would be in the same situation where we'd be able to regulate that. Colorado, they weren't able to regulate it. Why? They have the issue with gummy bears, gummy worms, Swedish fish, cookies, you name it. But it is true, 50% of the market in Colorado is edibles. So it's something in Massachusetts that, whether you're in favor of legalization of marijuana or not, the ballot questions is most likely going to be on the ballot in November, and we need to be prepared from a regulatory standpoint to deal with it.
And
Where does this stand right now? I mean, this is a potential ballot question.
Yeah, it's
a potential ballot question. The process is that we collected 103,000 raw signatures of voters from across the Commonwealth. Those signatures were certified by the Secretary of State's office, and then the bill is filed in the legislature. If the legislature doesn't pass the bill by May 3rd, then we have to go out and collect another 10,792 certified signatures, and then once those are certified by the Secretary of State, then it'll be on the ballot in November 8th, 2016. And just to address the edibles situation, Colorado just passed a regulation that said that they will more tightly regulate edibles. They'll make sure that they're in child-proof packaging, that the edibles will say on them, keep out of reach of children, and they'll be in individual packages, so that, I mean, we can't act in loco parentis for everyone. We can't prevent the parents, we can't dictate to the parents of these children that they need to be careful, but we can take steps, and the initiative has in it the Cannabis Control Commission, which will regulate all of those things, and they're mandated to regulate edibles.
Now, Attorney Sullivan, I mean, do you think that if we have these packages that say keep out of the reach of children, is that effective enough for you, and what's your opinion?
We put it on cigarette packets for 50 years, but marketing of cigarettes was to kids, because only 5% of the folks that smoke cigarettes and get addicted, after 21, only 5% get addicted. The marijuana industry needs to hook kids early. It's about 10% of the folks that haven't used marijuana before 21 end up using. So they're going to make their money on that. Let me ask you, Will, do you guys agree, your lobby, not to take a single cent from an outside Massachusetts donor? Can we make this a Massachusetts issue here today? And what I'm saying is that billions of dollars are being poured into different campaigns around the country. Can you guys agree to only do this with Massachusetts people, citizens? Can you agree that your donor base will only be Massachusetts? Of course you can't. George Soros is a billionaire, and he's poured in millions of dollars to promote marijuana. And it should be Massachusetts citizens that decide this. It should be Massachusetts donors that decide it.
right. And I would say,
And you guys can't agree to it because you know you're going to get millions of dollars
That's a
from all
red
around the country.
herring. That
It's
is
not a red
herring.
herring.
well, if
And
I
I'll
could
tell you,
add
and I'll tell you why.
If we could let Senator Welch, please.
I would say in and I understand certainly where District Attorney Sullivan's coming from. I would say that I would hope that if you know, people who take, whether it's law enforcement or otherwise, take a strong view against the legalization of marijuana, they'll also take as strong a view against the legalization of alcohol, because in many cases alcohol is much more of a gateway drug, much more addictive, much more damaging than marijuana is. And that's where I fall in terms of, you know, trying to find the balance that people who are dead set against marijuana certainly don't have the same opinion when it comes to alcohol.
You've said that you think that medical marijuana is appropriate in Massachusetts. Medical marijuana, the initiative was sponsored almost entirely by Peter Lewis, who was the CEO of Progressive Insurance. All of that money came from outside of Massachusetts, and you've said it's good. What's the difference?
Let me tell you about medical
What's
marijuana.
The difference?
For debilitating illnesses, it's appropriate. It's being abused around Massachusetts. You have kids that are 21, 22, 23 saying they have debilitating depression or anxiety. That's not the purpose of that bill. I was opposed to the terms of that bill because it never defined debilitating illness. I would never want somebody who's suffering from cancer or some debilitating illness not to have the option of marijuana, but it's being exploited by people right now in Massachusetts. Folks that do not have debilitating illnesses are getting prescriptions. But let's get back to the point.
You didn't answer my question.
What's that?
What about the medical marijuana initiative that Peter Lewis sponsored almost entirely?
That
Why is that wrong?
There was nothing wrong
outside,
with having marijuana.
It was money outside of
I didn't see
outside
anything
of
wrong with medical marijuana for
right.
debilitating illnesses. But you're going to get money from outside the state. Why not let the citizens of Massachusetts decide this issue with their own resources?
And that's exactly why we have this program today, to let Massachusetts residents decide. You guys did touch upon a good point, though. We're talking about health issues, debilitating diseases. This is something that we are going to continue to talk about here on 22 News in Focus. The public health concerns and address that. Possible benefits of marijuana. It's all coming up on 22 News in Focus. Welcome back to 22 News in Focus. Today we are talking about the possible legalization of recreational marijuana here in Massachusetts, along with the potential benefits and drawbacks. Now, Massachusetts voters approved medical marijuana in 2012. 2 years later, the first dispensary opened. Now, almost 4 years later, there are 4 dispensaries across the state serving more than 18,000 people. Dr. Roos, I'd like to start with you here on this. Are there any medical concerns when it comes to marijuana? Before we talk about this being addictive, do you think that is true?
There's solid evidence that marijuana has an addictive potential, absolutely. It depends a little bit on when the age of first use starts. So there's good evidence to suggest that about 1 in 6 adolescents that first uses marijuana will develop a dependence upon it, and about 1 in 12 adults that uses marijuana will develop an addiction to it. There's certainly a psychoactive component to it that can impair short-term memory, judgment, coordination, and there can be some negative health effects that can play out over time, such as an increased association with certain mental health conditions, as well as how that may lead to a potential for addiction for both marijuana or other substances.
But do you think there are any potential positive impacts of this? There are also studies that show that this can have a good impact on people's health, depending on what debilitating disease you might have.
You bring up a very interesting point, because what we know about marijuana as a medicine sometimes gets a little misconstrued. What we started using marijuana, which I kind of describe as that greenish, grayish products of the cannabis sativa plant, well in the 2700 BC for therapeutic purposes in Central Asia. It moved into Western medicine in the 1800s and is used quite commonly in the early 20th century. It was in the mid 20th century, around 1940, that actually it started moving out of medicine and then was regulated with the Controlled Substances Act in 1970. What happened at that point was that marijuana became classified as a Schedule I substance, so that a substance that was deemed to have no therapeutic benefit and to be one of considerable harm. But over the course of the next several decades, a couple things happened. People that were using marijuana, particularly those that were struggling from cancer or HIV, they started to notice some potential positive benefits, like reduction in nausea or increase in appetite. And so there became an increase interest in studying marijuana for medical purposes. We found out what THC was in the 60s. We found out what the cannabinoid receptors were in the 70s and then in the further decades. But what exists now is limited evidence for specific indications that for me is a proof of a concept, that we should look at the cannabinoids that are present in the cannabis plant and study them for their specific medical purposes to identify a dose that works, a formulation that works, and if there's potential side effects. We have not done that to the degree that I feel is required and what the regulatory agencies of the United States would require to really classify marijuana or marijuana products as medicine, with the exception of a few that have been classified in that way. Because we do actually have a couple of products, dronabinol and two others, or one other I should say, and one that's in development, that uses cannabinoids for specific medical purposes. But marijuana is oftentimes smoked or ingested, and there's a number of cannabinoids that we don't know the full range of effects on. There's no established dose or quantity, and so to think of it as medicine now, in my view, is flawed because it's not regulated and we lack quality control. It doesn't have a science and evidence base for what the dose should be for certain conditions, and we don't have a mechanism to monitor for adverse effects, so that when somebody initiates it for a medical purpose, there's no mechanism to report side effects or overdoses or fatalities as we do with other medicines. So I think we need to take the cannabinoids and use them and study them for what their therapeutic purpose should be.
Can I say something
Please,
about
please.
addiction? I think it's important to understand that marijuana is not addicting in the same way that, in fact, it probably creates more of a dependence than an addiction. It's not addicting in the same way that alcohol and opiates are, because there's no physical withdrawal. There's no need for medical attention when someone is stopping the use of marijuana. And I didn't do the math. I don't know what the 1 in 12 is, but it's my understanding that 9% of the people who regularly use marijuana become dependent on it. And my question is, why should we ask the other 91% of the people who can use marijuana personally to stop using marijuana because of the 9% who may have a dependence?
And this is a question that I have for all of you. I mean, we talk about marijuana and if it is addictive, something that I think we can also, we've heard before, is marijuana is a gateway drug. I mean, on that front, I mean, how do you all feel about that?
Well, I personally believe, and I'm not a doctor, I'm not a scientist, but I certainly, and anybody watching at home who's had experience with loved ones who have been addicted to alcohol or other substances, and if they're familiar with marijuana, certainly understand that oftentimes it's really the individual. It could be alcohol, it could be marijuana, whatever the first drug of choice that they try would be the gateway drug. And you know, obviously by legalizing marijuana, there is the potential of creating a situation where you know, the view of marijuana from a standpoint of using it publicly or using it in mass amounts across the population would kind of dull the reception to it, and that is a concern of potentially having children and having kids being, I guess there being less of a stigma attached to using marijuana. So that's kind of where I come down on that.
Mr. Luzier?
The only way that marijuana is a gateway drug is that it's a gateway to dealers that have other kinds of drugs. They might have cocaine or ecstasy, and so you're driving those folks who want to buy marijuana to dealers that have other more dangerous drugs with a higher profit margin. That's number one. Number two, like the senator says, if someone has a tendency to a substance use disorder, anything that they first try is going to be their gateway, whether it's cigarettes or alcohol or milk.
Attorney Sullivan?
The gateway to addiction and where we are right now with opioids and alcohol and marijuana is the early use. And it's predicted by genetics, but also age of initiation. And as I mentioned, 12.8 years of age is when the first use of marijuana. And by putting the good housekeeping seal of approval on marijuana, because that's really what they're asking to make it acceptable. We have another drug that's going to be more readily available, and that's another potential addiction. And I think that we have to look at what the impact is going to be on youth, their brain development, and what we're really saying as a society. This is more acceptable, it's more available, and I think that those addictions that we deal with on the long term, they all start between 12 and 21 for the most part. Most people don't become addicted to substances if they've waited until after 21. And it's a myth to think that by regulating it, that kids aren't going to be able to get it more readily. It's going to be acceptable, and more kids are going to use it. We've seen it in Denver. We've seen it in Washington. The age of initiation goes down, and the use goes up. It's simple as that. That's what the facts are.
In your experience, I mean, does that hold true?
So addiction is a chronic brain disease that has created a mechanism in which an individual ends up losing control over their use of a substance despite experiencing negative consequences. Marijuana is a substance that can create both psychological and, to some extent, physical withdrawal symptoms, while they are definitely not nearly as pronounced or significant as alcohol physical withdrawal or opiate physical withdrawal. When we think about the gateway theory, that is a theory that looks at the brain's reward system. And the earlier that an individual, a child, in these cases in which we're talking, is experienced or is experimenting with a substance that overrides that reward pathway, whether it's nicotine, alcohol, or cannabis, or cocaine, or another substance, that is what puts them at risk for further substance use disorders or addiction later.
Now next on 22 News in Focus, we are going to talk about marijuana and crime. I'll show you some statistics that you're going to want to see. You're watching 22 News in Focus. Thanks for joining us here on 22 News in Focus. We're talking about the possibility of marijuana being legalized in Massachusetts, and now we're going to shift the focus on crime. New research from the American Civil Liberties Union shows marijuana arrests account for more than half of all drug arrests in the United States, and 88% were for possession. Now, off the bat, I mean, what are the current laws here in Massachusetts? I mean, do you think people should be incarcerated for possessing marijuana if this is a non-violent crime?
If I can. And since 2008, there is no crime for possession of marijuana under 1 ounce. It's 0%. But there's 0% for arrests, convictions. There is no incarcerate. No, you let me finish. For simple possession of marijuana, from youth all the way up to adults, they're not prosecuted. There's been 0. In my district of Hampshire and Franklin counties, no one has ever been prosecuted since I've been DA for possession of marijuana for under 1 ounce. So simply, there is no issue here in Massachusetts. It's been decriminalized since 2008.
2 things. The first is that since decriminalization in 2008, in the 4 years after that, there were 4,600 people who were charged with possession of marijuana. So the possession issue has not gone away just because we had decriminalization. The ACLU did a study in 2013 that said that African American men were 4 times more likely to be arrested for possession of marijuana than their white counterparts, even though usage is similar. And in some counties, for instance, Plymouth and Barnstable counties, it's 10 times the arrests for African American youth than it is for white youth. And so the illegality of it is being used as a racial bias.
Your statistics are old and they're bogus. There is 0% in Massachusetts. If you look at 2015, 2014, I don't know what happened back in 2009. I became DA in 2011. I can tell you for a fact it's never happened, it never will, because the law is what I respect, and that it's been decriminalized and that there are 0%. What they really want to do is they want to take in nationwide statistics. And remember, this is all about Massachusetts legalization. It's a non-issue. There are no arrests, there are no convictions for possession. And if you can give me one person in Hampshire, Franklin, or Hampden County that's been convicted for marijuana possession under 1 ounce, Tell me who it is, and I'll do the appeal, and I'll overturn that
Senator
conviction.
Welch, I mean, let me hear your opinion on this.
Well, I can say after our trip from Colorado, the one thing that was crystal clear to us, I think, as senators, is that all the data that's out there, whether we're talking about law enforcement, whether we're talking about addiction, whether we're talking about usage, you can find data that will tell the story on one side, one will tell the story in the middle, and one will tell the story on the complete other side. The state of Colorado did not have any baseline data when this industry was thrust into them. So now they're a couple of years into legalization of marijuana, and they may have statistics, but they have nothing to compare it to. So any statistics that you may see out there, in my opinion, you really need to dig to find out what the real statistics are, or what the competing statistics are, whether it comes to usage among youth, whether it comes to increase in DUIs or decreases in DUIs. The statistics to me really are not, anybody that throws statistics out there, to me, unfortunately, is using a biased statistic.
Now, you mentioned something. You talked about DUIs, DWIs. I mean, how would this work in Massachusetts if recreational marijuana was legalized? I mean, would DUIs for that still exist?
Sure. Well, in Colorado, and one thing we heard from law enforcement was that because it's such a new situation for them, when they pull somebody over and suspect them of DUI, there's obviously no breathalyzer for marijuana usage, and they use a blood test, which with the use of marijuana can stay in your bloodstream for up to 30 days. But the one thing the police officers did also say and admit to was that typically, or what they have seen, is an increase in dual DUIs. Basically, somebody who is pulled over for driving erratically and then is tested both for alcohol and for marijuana. And once they found out that is alcohol, that they tested positive for alcohol, they didn't necessarily go down the marijuana path. So now they're doing that, which is part of the reason for the increase in, or the statistics that show an increase of pulling people over and convictions for DUI.
Okay. Now, another question that I have as well.
Marijuana, I should say.
Another question that I have is, when we talk about recreational marijuana, would people be able to grow this in their own home? I mean, how would that work if this does become legalized here?
Well, the campaign is called the Campaign to Regulate Marijuana Like Alcohol. And so folks are able to brew their own beer. They're able to, my dad used to make wine. And so analogously, folks will be able to grow up to 6 marijuana plants under the initiative, and up to 12 if there are 2 people in the house that are growing. And they can possess 1 ounce in public, and they can possess up to 10 ounces at home, so long as 9 ounces of those are locked.
And now, Dr. Roos, I mean, when we talk about people being able to grow their own marijuana in their home, do you think that there should be regulations in place prohibiting certain people from doing that if they have had any previous instances of addiction or any struggles in that sense?
That's a complex question for me to answer in regards to the legality of restricting people from something that may have been put into statute. My concern is really around the availability of marijuana, and in that as we increase availability, that makes it more accessible to individuals who will be at risk for developing problems.
We already have an epidemic in this country with drug driving and with drunk driving. And impaired driving because of marijuana is clear. It impairs people's judgment, their perceptions. 36% of the folks that have been tested after fatalities had marijuana in their system. Now, we don't have a very good system now for detecting how long it was in there. But anybody who smokes marijuana and drives, it's just as bad as if they had had a 12-pack of beer. So we got to be very cognizant about the fact that we have a number of people already that are drug driving, and we're going to have even more. And we're going to have more fatalities. In Australia, when they studied the fatalities, after alcohol, marijuana was second. So we're going to have the same situation here. We're going to have more carnage on the road. And I don't mean this to be as scare tactics. It's simple. The more that people use, the more that they abuse, and the more they abuse, the more they lack judgment when they get behind the wheel of a car.
Here's one thing that the DA and I agree on. no one should be driving while they're impaired, whether they're impaired by alcohol, marijuana, or if they haven't slept for 24 hours. And bottom line is, though, the police officers, many of them are now trained to detect marijuana in a roadside sobriety test. And that will be available, and there will be, you know, the doctor has suggested that there are problems with the research around marijuana because there hasn't been a lot of research done because the government doesn't allow it. But there will be a test, a breathalyzer test. There's a company in Oakland that's in the testing phases of a device that will allow for the testing for current impairment of marijuana. And that's about 2 years away, probably.
Right.
Now, we are going to continue our conversation about regulation and crime, as well as address social issues surrounding recreational marijuana, coming up after the break. You're watching 22 News in Focus. Welcome back to 22 News in Focus. If you are just joining us this afternoon, we're talking about recreational marijuana possibly being legalized here in Massachusetts. Now, our panel has addressed the possible health effects and regulation issues surrounding legalization. Now, I want to talk about the possible economic impact. Senator Welch, I know that you were in Colorado. What did you see economically out there after recreational marijuana did become legalized?
Sure. Well, of course, they're only a couple years into the industry being present in Colorado, and the most real numbers that we got from regulators, or I should say the administration in Colorado, was that this fiscal year about $75 to $100 million in revenue from the legalization of marijuana, or the adult use marijuana industry. I would say that from a standpoint, and that's before paying for any of the costs associated with the implementation, the putting in the infrastructure in terms of the regulation, the inspectors. There's a whole lot that goes into law enforcement. There's a whole lot that goes into making sure that the industry is running the way that they would like it to. So $75 to $100 million may sound like a lot of money, but I would say from at least from the Colorado standpoint, I did not get an indication that if money is the motivating factor, that should not be the reason to support legalization.
Dr. Roos, I know you have some interesting perspective on this too.
I think, in fact, in regards to that topic, where generating revenue seems like a very attractive impetus to do something like this, that doesn't, as Senator mentioned, doesn't consider the regulatory costs and the law enforcement costs and so forth, but it really doesn't also impact the social costs, the public health costs, and the medical costs. When we think about those costs, we're talking about conditions that need to be treated, like addiction, as well as other chronic mental health or medical conditions that ultimately need treatment later. We're also thinking about social costs to employers for missed work, for disability, for patients losing their ability to have private insurance and going on to state or federal insurance programs. Those other public and societal costs, when we look at other substances, dwarfs by a magnitude of 10 or more the revenue that's generated by taxes for these sorts of substances.
Can I say a little thing about something about the income? The revenue that's generated, the tax revenue, also doesn't take into account all of the jobs that are created, all of the ancillary industries that are created, all of the real estate transactions that are created. It also doesn't take into account the cost of prosecuting people for marijuana that has reduced almost to zero in Colorado. And so those are costs that have been indicated in Colorado that aren't necessarily reflected in just the tax revenue.
Now, Attorney Sullivan, I see you over there shaking your head.
It's really the human cost. It's the cost to our teens and youth from dropping out of school from chronic marijuana use. It's the brain development. That's something we can't put a price tag on. I'd like a single mom or dad that has had a teen with chronic marijuana use say it's a good thing. They won't say that. And when we look at this legislation, it's about big tobacco, big marijuana, making big money.
Dr. Roos, I mean, we talk about chronic marijuana use among teenagers. Is that a common thing? I mean, here in Massachusetts, do we see that?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, evidence would show across the country that the majority of 12th graders will have used marijuana by the time they enter the 12th grade. And there is a percentage of them that are using somewhat regularly. And what D.A. Sullivan may be alluding to as we think about these long-term costs to our youth and to our productive workforce later are the long-term benefits when looking at large studies of tens of thousands of kids in Australia and New Zealand that were using marijuana. Not that regularly. 8 times a year, we've seen decreases in IQ, graduation of high school, and entrance exams to universities. So there are those subtle and long-term but very, very important costs that should be recognized as well.
Senator Welch.
I would say, and there's a flip side, of course, to those statistics as well in terms of youth using marijuana and being able to have access to marijuana. I mean, we can't put our heads in the sand. We have to really understand that marijuana is available to our youth right now. It may be on the black market, but it's readily available. And the fact that Colorado, the one thing I think that we came away from Colorado in a positive spin was that after legalization, they really put a lot of money, a lot of resources, and a lot of effort into public awareness about how dangerous marijuana can be and when it's used by, especially amongst their youth. And I think that it's important. We have to be adults. We have to have conversations about these subject matters. We can't ignore it. I mean, the reality is, I mean, you mentioned statistics, and it just proves the fact that it is available. It's currently readily available to our youth, and if we really want to address it, what's the best way to do it? We can't ignore it and say it's going to go away if we don't legalize it.
Youth use of alcohol and cigarettes has gone down since we started educating youth about using those substances. And what we need to start doing is start telling the truth to young people about the effects of marijuana and the fact that they shouldn't use it until they reach an appropriate age. And we have to stop conflating use and abuse. And once we can start telling young people the truth about marijuana and about its effects, then they will have the same reaction that they have had with alcohol and cigarettes.
Do you think that
youth
we
use
need
will
better
go down.
public awareness here in Massachusetts?
Absolutely.
I mean, one thing that I would agree on, and I think that the most important thing that we can do when we are addressing substance use is prevention, intervention, and treatment. And that is really where the focus of our energy, our efforts, and hopefully our dollars should be going towards. And the costs, and I also want to make sure that we're not conflating legalization and decriminalization, because they are very different concepts, actually. And there's an enormous cost to criminalizing marijuana possession or use, and I would never advocate for that, and feel an enormous public health benefit to the decriminalization and the true decriminalization of marijuana use, so that people that do identify and have problems, they can access treatment, and we are not creating a cycle of incarceration again. But we also worry about, when we think about that public health benefit and we commercialize the use of a substance that's psychoactive, ultimately, the companies tend to, in speaking to Mr. Luzer's comment before about racial bias in terms of arrests, we have to be careful about racial bias and focusing on poor and disenfranchised when focusing on marketing and looking and the use and initiation of substances, because that's really the folks that bear the burden of the public health and medical costs and societal costs in the future.
Okay. Well, coming up on 22 News in Focus, each of our panel members are going to have the time to convince you if you agree, should recreational marijuana be considered here in Massachusetts. You're watching 22 News in Focus. You're watching 22 News in Focus, and we have been discussing the health and legal ramifications if marijuana was legalized here in Massachusetts. I'd like each of our panel members here to address the viewers now. Tell them if you think pot should be legalized and why. Starting with you, Senator Welch.
Well, I'm going to leave that up to each individual voter, because they're going to get a chance to vote on it in November. I would say that, before they go into the voting booth, I hope that they'll take a real strong, hard look at the ballot question and really do the research as to the pros and cons of legalization of marijuana. I would say that, from my opinion, If you're looking at it from a financial aspect, a revenue aspect, I would say that that's probably not the way to look at it. I don't think the revenue will outpace, in any large respect, outpace what it'll cost to implement the system in Massachusetts. I would say that if you feel as though adults should have the ability to purchase marijuana and use it, in the comfort of their own home, then I would say that you do your research and make sure you understand what the potential drawbacks are. But also understand that we in Massachusetts, and I think because of the creation of the special commission, Senate Commission on Marijuana, we're going to be in a position, if the ballot question does pass, to better deal with the marijuana issue than Colorado and even Washington State. So I'd say it's really up to each individual voter to make their decision. Obviously, you have an array of opinions here on the panel. I guess I fall somewhere in the middle, but I would say that it's important for them to do their research. I think the ballot question, unfortunately, is about 40 pages long. 24 pages long, so it might be a little difficult, but really do the research and really find out what the pros and cons are before you step into the voting booth.
Mr. Luzier.
I invite everyone to read the initiative because I think it's important that they understand it, like the senator says. There have been 4 states in the District of Columbia that have already authorized the adult use of marijuana. Those are Washington, Colorado, Oregon, and Alaska. There are 5 other states that will have this issue on the ballot in 2016. California, Nevada, Arizona, Maine, and Massachusetts. Vermont just today passed in the Judiciary Committee in the Senate, said that they are going to move forward on a marijuana adult use bill. Rhode Island is very close to doing that. So we are not going to be the only ones who will have adult use of marijuana in New England. 58% of the people across the country favor authorizing the adult use of marijuana. We feel that the numbers in Massachusetts are very similar. So we will continue to work very hard to educate the public about the benefits of authorizing adult use of marijuana, and we feel that on November 9th that we will be successful.
Attorney Sullivan.
This is a pediatric issue as much as a legal issue. It's about our youth being exposed to psychoactive drugs at an early age, and for society to put the stamp of approval on it. And we can't be in the middle, and I beg to differ. We must, as parents and grandparents, aunts and uncles, make that decision. Is this going to help our youth? Is this going to help our society? This isn't about arrests or incarceration. There are none for possession of marijuana. What this is really about is what happened in the nicotine industry 50 years ago. They marketed to kids. They marketed cigarettes, and millions of people who died of cancer later, now we know what the risks were. And I think when everybody leaves here, just remember, this legalization is about gummy bears, chocolate milk, and making sure that marijuana is acceptable and that it impacts our youth. We didn't know much about brain research 20, 30 years ago, but now we know. We know about the receptors. We know about how kids learn. And think about it. What does it cost one kid, whether they're black, white, Latino, to drop out of school because they're chronic marijuana users? Those are the risks, not just to the brain, but to futures. And that's why I'm strongly opposed as a parent first, and as a DA second, and as somebody that sees the public health damage that's been done by all these substances, whether they're alcohol, opioids, or marijuana.
Dr. Roos.
Well, I thank you for the opportunity to be part of this group today, and this is a really interesting topic. We've heard a lot of very good opinions about this. As a medical expert and an addiction specialist amidst an opiate addiction epidemic, one thing that we know very well to be true is that substance use is the single greatest cause of preventable death in this country when we factor in alcohol, nicotine, and other drugs. It can shorten lives, impact families, impact work, and the whole community and society. So as an addiction specialist and as somebody who's focusing on public health, I think our attention should really be on prevention of individuals from using substances, intervention for those who are in treatment for individuals who have developed a problem. We must not criminalize substances and focus on our efforts to make sure people can access treatment. And we really need to be careful about initiatives that are going to increase access to a psychoactive substance that can have addictive potentials if it's being used outside of a medical context. And so because of those reasons, I support prevention and treatment. I don't think legalization is the road towards that end.
And one thing I think I can say that I think you all seem to agree on here is that when we talk about recreational marijuana or any type of drug, that we need to raise awareness. So moving forward, whether this does become a ballot question or not, do you think there is still a need to raise the awareness about any possible effects of marijuana on youth particularly?
Absolutely. I think, you know, just like any drug, or whether it's alcohol, marijuana, opiates, or prescription drugs, we need to have direct conversations with our youth, whether it's our children, grandchildren, or whoever, about the real dangers that that can go along with youth use. Of course, statistics are going to show that potentially on the other side that marijuana, not necessarily amongst youth, but amongst adults, is not addictive, and you're going to find opinions on both sides. But I think we as adults need to have those conversations. And we can't put our heads in the sand. We have to really be proactive about it.
Mr. Luzier?
No one is saying that marijuana is harmless, but it's certainly less harmful than alcohol. And our laws need to reflect the relative issues regarding those substances. So absolutely, we need to make sure that folks understand the effects of marijuana and how it affects them personally when they use it before they even start, and that's important.
Attorney Sullivan.
We're involved every day with prevention initiatives for alcohol, opioids, and marijuana, and we're going to continue to need to do that. But we only get one chance to raise our kids, and we only get one chance for the brain to function fully and to be successful in life, and to keep that prevention there. And we don't want to go to treatment. It's so much more expensive to do treatment. So when we look at this issue, we have to fight the fight now. We can't let the industry of marijuana say, let's wait until after November 7th. We've got to really dig in now, and as caring parents, adults, really dig in and say that this is the wrong direction.
Dr. Roos.
I agree with everybody. Prevention is really the key when we think about this. There's nothing about anything that we've said today, as Mr. Luzier said, that suggests that marijuana products are necessarily safe and harmless. Prevention is important. For every dollar in conversation that we put into prevention, it will save us countless lives in the end.
And Senator Welch, maybe this is something that you can speak on. I mean, currently when it comes to funding, I mean, is the funding available to make sure that the proper prevention can happen, that these campaigns can happen?
Well, I think at this point we can't put enough money into prevention and public awareness, and obviously we're seeing the issue with opioids being and prescription drugs really being an issue right now that we're trying to focus on and get our arms around, and it's gonna take a while, and it's gonna take on an awful lot of resources and money and people working very hard to make that happen.
And do you think moving forward that we should consider the state investing more funding into this moving forward?
More money into prevention?
Yes.
Oh, absolutely. I think we all, as legislators, the administration, and you know, district attorneys and law enforcement and people in public health all feel as though that, like I said, we can't put enough money into it because one life that is lost because of addiction is one life too many.
Now stay with us. We will have the last word for you after the break. You're watching 22 News in Focus. You're watching 22 News in Focus. Today we have addressed the possible legalization of marijuana here in Massachusetts. We hope you've learned something about this timely and controversial topic and are informed enough to make a decision should the issue come to a vote in November. Now, on our panel today, we did have State Senator James Welch. We did have Will Luzier from the campaign to regulate marijuana like alcohol. We had Northwestern District Attorney David Sullivan and Dr. Robert Roos from Sisters of Providence Health System. So thank you all so much for joining us today. And that is our program. We want to thank you, our guests, for joining us as well. And thank you at home for watching. If you missed any of it, you can watch it in full on our website, wwlp.com. From all of us here at 22 News, we wish you a wonderful Sunday, and we'll see you next week.